Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Welcome to part 3 of my conversation with Les Willans. From November 2004 through to 2006, Les is working not at Woodford, but seconded to British Aerospace Systems in Samlesbury. He's there to learn about a new product for which Woodford is to be given the responsibility for the design. I think you'll be surprised to hear that this new contract is for work on the vertical tail of the F35 Joint Strike Fighter, the massive American initiative to develop a family of affordable fifth-generation stealth fighters for the Air Force, Marines and Navy. Les explains how the thinking of the design team at Woodford leads to significant savings in design and manufacturing costs, earning the approval of the American Department of Defense. Les also talks about his unique approaches to the design process, which go right back to his days as an apprentice. And we hear the moving story of how one manager gave Les feedback which had a long-lasting impact on his confidence and self-esteem. Sadly, this part of our conversation ends with the demise of Woodford. Les recalls how the news of the cancellation of the MRA4 Nimrod contract reached the workers, and he remembers the inevitable decline in morale that followed when people's futures were so uncertain. And he plays his part in encouraging colleagues, reminding them that their highly valued training and experience in a company with an enviable reputation meant that, for many, there would be life after Woodford. But we start off 7 years before Woodford closes on an upbeat note with this crucial contract for the American Defense Department as the work on the F-35 begins. I started off by saying that many listeners would probably be surprised to find out about Woodford's important contribution to the Joint Strike Fighter program. Les starts off by explaining that this work was also a bit of a surprise for the workforce at the time.
Yeah. Well, it came as a bit of a surprise to us, really. We were sort of banded together, if you like, with some of our boss, Bruce. He said, right, we're going to need some of you lads. We've got a job we've been looking to foster on site because they'd looked at the workload and thought, oh, we've got no work. I mean, I'm going to have to make a lot of people redundant. And it sort of fell in with the business Wharton were pursuing. And there was a big package of work that they needed to do. I hadn't got the manpower to do it without subcontracting it all over again to another subcontract design organisation. And our management team went along and said, look, we've got all these people with all this experience. You know, we've got 20 and 30 years of experience in design and manufacturing engineering and stress engineers that could do this work for you. And so they looked at us and said, yeah, well, you know, give us a proposal. And there was a proposal put forward. And then ultimately we were told what the project was. And then we had to go through a process of having all our security clearances improved because we were dealing with the Americans and they had a different outlook on their security. And so our security level had to be gone through all over again and assessed. And so then we were given the task of then finding out what bit of the aeroplane we were going to be doing, and we found out that it was going to be the F-35B, which was the hovering aircraft, which is based similar to the Harrier jump jet. So it was their version of it. There are 3 variants of the F-35. There was a 35A, an F-35B, and an F-35C. The F-35A is the traditional takeoff and landing aircraft. The F-35B is the hover aircraft, very much like the Harrier jump jet, which was flown by the US Marine Corps, similar to the Harrier, or the AV-8B that they called it. And the F-35C was a carrier-borne aircraft with folding wingtips, which is something that Wharton and Salisbury and other people were going to undertake. So Wharton and Salisbury did the design work for the F-35B, and we were going to be undertaking the similar project on the F-35B. So the F-35A was the vertical tail of the F-35. So it's a subsection of the aircraft. And the F-35A has, all of them have two vertical tails, one on the left and one on the right of the centre line, in a sort of semi-diagonal V on this. We had to then go through a similar process of understanding the breakdown of the component parts and the design philosophy of the original F-35A. And as we were progressing through this, we quickly realised that, hang on a minute, there's lots of parts here. Why have we got lots of parts? So they designed a left-hand and a right-hand part, on a left-hand part and a right-hand part. And so we tried to rationalise the number of parts we could manufacture by making the left-hand component fit on the right-hand side of the aircraft as well as the left-hand side of there. So we made one component out of two components. So we have the number of component parts, if you like, on the aircraft. At which point somebody at Salisbury and Wharton said, you can't do that. So we said, why not? I said, well, you've made the item heavier. I said, yeah, but we've reduced the cost of the layup tools. We've reduced the tooling costs by a half. And the Americans are quite happy to reduce the tooling costs because that's saving them an awful lot of money. And the small increase in weight can be addressed somewhere else on the aircraft. So whatever you've done might be all right, but we've done something completely different. And that was the way, realistically, we as an organisation thought, if you like, in a different way than most other people think. And that's something that was obviously come from the work we've done on civil aircraft. If you can't make it in one part, why can't you? So that was sort of drummed into us in a roundabout way. So cost was always on our mind because of the cost of, Wharton's thinking was, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, well, it's a government contract. The government's always going to pay us. Wrong. You can't survive if you don't have a budget. And if you don't stick to the budget, you're not going to get the job.
So you had the best part of a year at Salisbury, really learning.
Yeah. A lot of travelling.
Yes. And then you come back to Woodford, 2005. We ought to stress this is not only top secret, this is really high-level, cutting-edge work.
He says, yeah.
You mentioned, for a long time now, you've been a senior principal design engineer. So,
yeah.
You've really, from apprentice.
Yeah,
so
I know.
It's been quite a...
It is quite a jump, you've learnt a lot in 25, 30 years of working on different projects and quizzing people along the way, So I think in some respects that people like myself and others like me, we've learnt a lot about the business as well as a lot about engineering, in a broad sense. You broaden your outlook on life and your outlook on manufacturing processes and other things that you've probably forgotten about as you do. You forgot what you've done in all that time. And sometimes you put it into practice and other things, home life and other things. Something that I decided at one point I was going to, we were going to have a new bathroom, and I set about in my spare time trying to do it in 3D and computer and showing the wife what I was doing. She said, I don't know what you're trying to explain to me. I said, well, I'm just trying to show you how the layout of the bathroom's going to look. She said, well, I still can't understand what you're showing me. So I said, well, you'll find out when all the bits arrive. And so when the bits arrived and it was all put in place, she said, oh, I understand what you're trying to tell me now. So some people think like that. So I have to say, once going back a bit, whilst we were going through a process on the ATP, I had a situation that's happened to me. It used to happen to all of us in some respect, where the senior designers or engineers would come around and want to know what you were doing, and they'd stand around your drawing board. And one chap said to me, what are you doing? And I told him what I was doing. I was actually doing something to do with a mechanism on the cargo door on the ATP. And he said, yeah, I was explaining what I was doing and what I've got on my drawing board. And he looked at me and he said, I'm a bit puzzled. I said, what's puzzling you? Well, I see you've got this cross-sectional view there, and you've got a view here. Where's the other two views of your projections on the drawing? So in real terms, in theory, you're supposed to isolate three separate views on your drawing. You can have a plan view, an end view, and then all different elevations. Just like opening up a box. If you open up a cardboard box along its line, it opens into three pieces. I said, well, I've got that and that. I said, the other bit is in my head. And he looked at me and he said, how do you do it? I said, what do you mean it's in your head? I said, I've got all the bits in front of me and I know what they all are. I've got all the detailed bits. I said, it's in my imagination, in my head. So I'm producing this from if you like, my imagination. He said, I can't do that. I said, well, why not? He said, I just can't. And I thought, everybody could do that. He said, no.
You're going back right to the beginning when you had that task to do as an apprentice.
Yeah.
You realise not everybody approached it the same way as you did.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's a quirk of people's life, isn't it? You don't realise you're different until somebody tells you you're different, which is, happened later on in life. I got to a point where I'm getting fed up being moved around from pillar to post, from factory to factory, and this, that, and the other. And I was sat down with my boss one day, and he said, "Right, we're going to have a one-to-one evaluation, 360-degree appraisal, and we'll go through them. But you can ask me questions and this, that." I said, "Yeah. Why do you keep moving me around? What have I done wrong?" He said, "What do you mean have you done wrong?" I said, "Well, I feel as though I'm being picked on and keep moving me about from one factory to another." He said, "No, it's quite the opposite, Les." He said, "You're somebody we can rely on." And I never thought about it in any way at all. I was quite humbled by it.
I'm sure you are. Yeah. Les, the Woodford story is really coming to its closing years.
Yeah, it was.
Because after the F35, 2008 to 2010, you're back on MRE4.
And that was a bit of a... No, it was very, I can't remember, think of the word I'm looking for. I think we were all looking towards the end. We'd all resigned ourselves, that there was an end point going to be happening. And how best do we manage this period in time? No, it wasn't we knew, but almost on the first instance with Nimrod, that there's going to be an end date. There was always a published end date of something like 2015, I think it was the projected end date. And then, as you probably, some people in the museum look at the data on the walls, that the government's cut back on the project numbers, that the requirement of the aircraft numbers they wanted to buy. And so the numbers started off, quite high, and then got down to almost signal figures as a requirement, as the amount of money that was being spent on the project was increasing. And so they obviously realised that they weren't getting value for money.
The maths no longer add up, do they?
No, the maths, and David Cameron, he decided in his infinite wisdom in 2010 that he was going to have his way and cancel all these projects. And that was the ultimate final demand.
Do you must remember that?
Oh, quite clearly. I can never forget that sort of period.
Where did the news come out? Were you at work?
We were at work, yeah.
Work when it came through?
But prior to that, the sort of, as the question you were asking me in the first place was, I got moved onto the project because somebody wanted to retire. A colleague of mine, his wife had a better job than him. She was being promoted as an area manager, and so he was going home to look after his child. And so I was asked, would I replace him? If I was, would I go and do the job that he was doing? That again was obviously, they thought I was the right fit for the job. So I said, yeah, fine, I'll go and do his job. And that's how I ended up on doing that job. So we were effectively working for Samlesbury and Wharton. Until by this time, really, I'd almost give up on solving problems and, the problems that were coming in during the build of the aircraft. I wasn't going to put an answer on. I was going to ask the boss. But at the end of the day, he had to sign it all off. The end date hadn't happened then. But when it did happen, the people that used to work in the office were all, the majority were subcontract labour, production engineers and design engineers. They were all on the phone to their agents, and there was a quick exodus of people between November and the following year when, we realised that the company was deciding we were going to shut down in March, April 2011. Lots of people were making their getaway beforehand. Strangely enough, I was on a holiday when all this was announced, all the redundancy packages and all this sort of carry on. And I'm trying to make contact with my colleague while I'm on a cruise ship. How am I going to get me redundancy? And he said, "Don't worry about it. You're all right. We'll sort it out. We appreciate that you're not there. We'll make representation for you." And so when we all got together, sorted all our pensions out and this, that, the other, and planning for the future. We all marched out the last day. We were car passes, security passes, goodbye to the security guard, see you again. And that was it. We all walked out and never saw each other again.
So thanks to that decision, 1,200 people lose their jobs.
Yeah.
It's the end for you after 31 years.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
It is, I know.
Were you here when were the aircraft broken up?
I was here when they did it. So, but part of doing the nothing was that we got to know that, and I think somebody leaked to the press that they were being broken up because tried down at flight sheds to put a barrier up between the two hangar with such a scaffold so they couldn't see it, but the helicopter went up instead and photographed it all. So we were watching it live on television being crushed. So all the work lockers that the fitters had on the shop floor were all scrapped. Don't ask me why they were scrapped. They could have sold them to people. All the toolboxes were going to be thrown away, but then they decided they could sell them. So we were given an option to buy toolboxes complete with tools. So that was all in this sort of period towards the very end, of the process. But sad that people had to make a judgment as to where they wanted to go next. Some people who hadn't got to a point like me. There were some of my colleagues who were, only 50 or younger than 50, had to continue working until they got to 55 at least. Some people went to Chester as part of the Airbus. Some people went to Wharton and Samlesbury. Some people left and were meant to other jobs. Some of my old apprentice come juniors that used to work on my group, I've seen subsequently. They used to come to me, Les, I'm going for another job. I said, what? And I used to say, why are you still here? And they look at me quizzically. I said, you do realise that when you go away from here, people have a great expectation because you've been trained by British Aerospace and they value your training. My wife's another one in question. She used to work here and she was part of the HR department and they got taken over by an entity and they were effectively subcontracted out. And then as the business was shutting down, it became a centralised HR department, if you like, and we were dealt with by Wharton. So she went somewhere else, and she's done that ever since. When she's got fed up with the job, she's gone from... And I said, why do you keep getting jobs? I said, you've retired. She said, well, they'll just look at the bit that says British Aerospace on my CV, and the fact that she's older and she's reliable. And that's another thing that people don't understand either, that people who work here, or have worked here, very reliable people in the main.
Once again, we do appreciate Les giving up his time to share all those experiences with us. In the final part of our conversation, next time, I asked Les to step back a little from those 31 years and 4 months of work in the aviation industry and to share his reflections on that long and successful career. Please join us for that. But for the moment, it's goodbye from me, Chris Bessett.
Make sure you follow us in your podcast app to ensure that you don't miss out on future episodes.